Welcome to Cozy Mystery Stories, where we unravel the case of the riddle of the Rose Garden. Our tale is set at the magnificent Blackwood Manor, a blooming estate in Kent, where the manicured lawns and prize-winning roses conceal a far less cultivated growth of human jealousy. Among the dedicated gardeners and distinguished guests, a web of secrets and resentments is about to be violently untangled, proving that the most beautiful blossoms can have the deadliest thorns. Chapter 1. There is a particular quality to the air in Kent in late June, a scent of damp earth, cut grass, and the impossibly sweet perfume of roses that clings to one's clothes like a persistent memory. It was this very perfume that greeted me upon my arrival at Blackwood Manor, an altogether impressive pile of Tudor brick and ivy that had stood, in one form or another, since the days of the first Elizabeth. Its current master, Lord Alistair Finch, was a man of a more recent and far more fragile vintage. My own presence there was a matter of quiet sentiment. I had once been governess to the children of his first wife's sister, and a standing invitation for a summer visit had been extended annually for a decade. This year, feeling the city stale and my own thoughts in need of pruning, I had accepted. Ah, but my dear reader, one rarely finds the peace one seeks. One merely exchanges one set of complications for another. Lord Alistair was a creature of singular passion. His life, since the passing of his dear Lillian, had narrowed to the singular pursuit of horticultural perfection. Specifically, the cultivation of a rose so unique, so deeply and tragically crimson, that he had named it the Crimson Tear. It was, I was told in no uncertain terms upon my arrival, his magnum opus, the culmination of a lifetime's breeding and the certain winner of the upcoming National Rose Society Prize. The household revolved around this flower with the gravity of planets orbiting a sun. There was, of course, the new Lady Finch, Elena. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with hair the colour of spun gold and eyes the shade of a summer sky after a storm. She possessed the sort of beauty that seems both effortless and immensely tiring to maintain. She treated her elderly husband with a solicitous affection that felt, to my eye, a fraction too polished, a performance for a rather limited audience. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much, yet revealed too little. Then there was Julian Croft, the head gardener. He was a man hewn from the Kentish soil itself, with hands like gnarled roots and a gaze as steady and territorial as a badger. He spoke of the gardens, and of the Crimson Tear in particular, with a possessive fervour that bordered on the fanatical. His devotion was shadowed by that of his niece, Beatrice Holloway, a quiet, pale girl who served as his assistant. She moved through the flower beds like a phantom, her presence marked only by the rustle of leaves and the silent, almost worshipful way she tended to the plants. The small party was completed by two guests who had arrived for a private viewing of the rose before its public debut. Mr. Arthur Pym was a rival rosarian of some repute, a portly, pompous little man whose face was perpetually flushed with either exertion or indignation. He and Lord Alistair shared a rivalry that was, I gathered, legendary in their small, thorny circle. The final guest was Dr. Lawrence Gable, the local physician and a long-time friend of the family. He was a handsome man in his middle years, with a reassuring bedside manner that could not quite conceal the weary lines of worry etched around his eyes. Overseeing the domestic sphere was Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, a woman whose natural state was a low-level fluster, and who navigated the currents of the house with a radar for impending disaster. The tension in the house was as thick and cloying as the scent of the night-blooming jasmine. It was jealousy, of course, a common enough weed in the garden of human emotions. Elena was jealous of the memory of the First Lady Finch, whose portrait gazed down from the mantelpiece with serene disapproval. Julian Croft was jealous of any who dared to even look upon his roses with less than reverential awe. And Mr. Pym was consumed with a jealousy so potent it seemed to radiate from him in waves of heat, a bitter envy of the Crimson Tear, and the acclaim it would bring to his old foe. On the second afternoon of my visit, the sky began to curdle, turning from a cheerful blue to a bruised and sullen grey. A strange, oppressive humidity descended, silencing the birds and making the very air feel heavy in one's lungs. Lord Alistair, oblivious to the coming storm, announced his intention to spend an hour alone in the greenhouse with his prize specimen. "The buds are on the very cusp of opening, Elspeth," he told me, his reedy voice trembling with excitement. "I must be there for the moment of their birth." He shuffled off, a frail figure of monomaniacal purpose, and the rest of us settled into the drawing room to await the storm. It broke with a theatrical clap of thunder that rattled the window panes. Rain followed, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that blurred the world outside into a watercolour of greens and greys. An hour passed then too. The storm raged, a primal, violent tantrum. It was Elena who first remarked upon her husband's absence. "Alistair is still in the greenhouse," she said, a delicate frown creasing her perfect brow. "He will catch his death." Dr. Gable offered to fetch him. He returned some 10 minutes later, his face pale, his coat slick with rain. The door to the main greenhouse is locked, from the inside. A sudden, cold dread seemed to fall upon the room, a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Julian Croft, who had been standing by the window, turned slowly. "The emergency latch can be forced. I'll get my tools." He and Dr. Gable ventured back out into the deluge. The rest of us waited in a strained, unnatural silence, the only sounds the drumming of the rain and the frantic ticking of the mantel clock. When the two men returned, their expressions told the story before a word was spoken. "Mrs." Davies gave a little cry and pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Lord Alistair Finch was dead. He was slumped in his favourite wicker chair, which he had positioned directly before the pedestal bearing the crimson tear. His head was bowed, as if in prayer to his creation. The great, blood-red buds of the rose were half unfurled, their velvet petals seeming to drink in the gloom of the greenhouse. And upon his pale, parted lips, as if placed there by a lover, lay a single, perfect crimson petal. As if on cue, the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. At the same moment, the telephone, which had been ringing unanswered with a call from the village exchange, gave a final, futile burble and fell silent. The storm had done its work. The bridge over the creek would be impassable, the lines down. We were trapped in the house with a body, and one had to assume a murderer. Chapter 2. One must always consider the little grey cells. In the absence of constabulary and the cold, clarifying light of day, fear is a most unreliable narrator. It points its trembling finger in all directions at once, making villains of us all. As Mrs. Davies fumbled with the candles, casting our strained faces in a ghastly, dancing light, I found myself observing, cataloguing, and arranging the facts as they presented themselves. The deceased, Lord Alistair Finch. The place of death, a greenhouse locked from the inside. The curious detail, a rose petal on his lips. Dr. Gable, his professional calm a thin veneer over a very human shock, made a preliminary examination by the light of a storm lantern. "There are no obvious signs of violence," he murmured, his hands surprisingly steady as he felt for a pulse he knew he would not find. "His colour, it suggests a cardiac event. A profound shock, perhaps." He paused, gently tilting Lord Alistair's head, then he stiffened. "Wait, what is this?" He pointed to the victim's right hand, which rested limply on the arm of the chair. On the tip of the index finger was a tiny, almost invisible puncture mark, inflamed and red around the edges. "Like a pinprick. Or," he said, his gaze travelling to the thorny stem of the rose bush, "a thorn." The suggestion hung in the air, potent and venomous. A poisoned thorn. It was the stuff of penny dreadfuls, and yet here we were. The door was bolted from within, Julian Croft stated, his voice a low growl. He had not moved from the doorway, his eyes fixed on the rose as if it, and not its owner, were the true victim. No one could have entered or left. "A suicide, then," Elena whispered, her hand fluttering to her throat. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like a startled nymph. Alastair would never, Dr. Gable said firmly. Not now, not with the competition so close. That rose was his life. A life for a rose, the thought was chilling. We retreated to the house, leaving the body where it lay, a silent sentinel in its glass tomb. The decision was a practical one. None of us wished to disturb what was now a crime scene. In the drawing room, the atmosphere curdled further into one of suspicion. We were a collection of actors, each playing the part of the innocent, and each, I suspected, silently rehearsing an alibi. My own quiet inquiries, framed as the ramblings of a slightly confused old woman, began to bear fruit. Mrs. Davies, when pressed for a restorative cup of tea, was a fountain of nervous information. "Oh, Miss Marwood, it's a tragedy, a terrible tragedy. And after the argument this morning too." "Argument?" I prompted gently. "Lord Alastair and Mr. Croft in the gardens, loud enough for the maids to hear. His lordship wanted to cut the first bloom to transport it to the show tomorrow. Mr. Croft, well, he was beside himself. Said it would damage the plant, that it was sacrilege to cut it before it had fully bloomed on the stem. He loves those roses more than people, he does. A motive of passion, perhaps, the gardener driven to protect his charge from its very creator. It seemed plausible. Julian Croft certainly possessed the requisite temperament, and as the estate's gardener, he would have access to all manner of chemical compounds. I later observed him in his potting shed, a small, cluttered sanctuary smelling of soil and insecticide. A large, clearly labelled bottle of concentrated nicotine sulfate, a potent poison, sat on a high shelf. Then there was Mr. Pym. I found him in the library, ostentatiously dabbing his brow with a silk handkerchief. He was performing grief and doing it badly. "A terrible business, a shocking end," he boomed. Alastair was a great man, a true artist. We had our differences, of course, professional disagreements, but this, his voice trailed off. I noticed his hands. He was wearing thin leather gloves which struck me as odd indoors. As he gestured, a faint, acrid smell wafted towards me, something vaguely chemical. When I inquired if he had perhaps been assisting Mr. Croft, he grew defensive. "Good heavens, no, I wouldn't dream of touching another man's soil. I was merely taking a constitutional around the perimeter before the storm, admiring the layout. Near the greenhouse, I presumed. With the crimson tear out of the competition, his own Pym's victory was now the clear favourite. A motive of pure, unadulterated ambition. Elena, the grieving widow, remained in her room, attended by a flustered maid. Her inheritance was, of course, the most straightforward motive of all, but a conversation with Mrs. Davies had complicated that particular equation. "Between us, miss," the housekeeper had whispered, her voice thick with conspiracy, "his lordship was seeing his solicitor last week. Talk of changing the will there was. He was thinking of leaving the house and the bulk of the estate to a new horticultural trust he was setting up. To preserve the gardens, you see. Her ladyship was not best pleased when she caught wind of it. So Lady Finch's motive was not one of impending wealth, but of preventing its loss. A crucial distinction. I also learned from a housemaid that Elena had claimed to be reading in her room all afternoon. Yet the maid had seen her returning to the house via the side terrace, her shoes damp, not long before the alarm was raised. A lie. And lies, my dear reader, are the soil in which deceit grows. Dr. Gable, the man of science, seemed the most level-headed amongst us. Yet he too had his secrets. I recalled a snippet of conversation I had overheard between him and Lord Alastair the previous day. The doctor's voice had been low, urgent. "Alastair, I must insist, it's a matter of professional ruin." Lord Alastair had been dismissive. "Lawrence, my finances are my own affair. I am not a bank. A man in debt is a man who is desperate, and a doctor of all people would know precisely how to administer a poison that might mimic a natural death. The key, it seemed to me, was the locked room. A man dies alone in a chamber bolted from within. If one dismisses suicide, one is left with a very clever puzzle. One must not look at the facts that are there, but consider the facts that are not. There was no sign of a hidden entry, no broken panes of glass. The mechanism was straightforward. It was the quiet one, Beatrice Holloway, who provided the next piece of the puzzle. I found her by the large, steaming compost heap at the far end of the kitchen garden. The storm had subsided to a miserable drizzle, and she was ostensibly turning the heap with a pitchfork, though her movements were listless. Her face was pale and blotchy with tears. "My uncle, he didn't mean what he said to his lordship," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's just so protective, that Rose is like his child." "I am sure no one truly suspects him," I murmured, a statement that was entirely false. Her eyes darted towards the compost. "I found something over there by the wall." She led me to the edge of the heap and pointed. Half hidden in the damp soil was a small glass vial, no bigger than my thumb. It was empty, but the faint, almond-like scent of no, not cyanide. Something different, something sweeter, more floral. I corked it with a small leaf and tucked it into my handbag. As we walked back, I considered the girl. She was devoted to her uncle, that much was clear. But there was a watchfulness about her, an intelligence in her quiet grey eyes that suggested she saw more than she spoke of. I also noticed a small, muddy footprint near the greenhouse door on the soft earth, a print that was decidedly too small and slender to belong to any of the men. Later that evening, in the roaring fire of the drawing-room grate, I found another piece. A fragment of a half-burned letter, missed by the housemaid's poker. Most of the words were gone, consumed by the flames, but a few phrases remained, written in Lord Alistair's spidery hand. "Cannot ignore it any longer. A debt of the past must be paid for the sake of her memory." A debt of the past. Whose memory? His first wife, Lillian, or someone else entirely? The little grey cells churned. A lie, a secret debt, a volatile argument, a rival's ambition, a gardener's passion, a discarded vial, and a small, muddy footprint. The pieces were all on the table. The picture they were beginning to form was one of exquisite, deadly design. Ah, but dear reader, the truth is often hidden in plain sight, disguised as something quite ordinary. The question was, which ordinary thing was the disguise and which was the truth? Chapter 3. The night stretched on, an eternity of dripping eaves and the groaning of an old house settling its bones. Sleep was a luxury none of us could afford. Every creak of a floorboard, every rattle of a window in the wind, was magnified into the footstep of a murderer. Paranoia, having been planted, was beginning to bloom as prodigiously as any rose in the garden. The second incident occurred shortly after midnight. Mr. Pym, who had declared his nerves required a stiff brandy, had gone to the library to fetch it. We heard a sudden, muffled cry, followed by the heavy thud of a falling body. Dr. Gable and I were the first to reach him. We found him sprawled on the Persian rug, his face ashen, a trickle of blood matting the silver hair at his temple. The brandy decanter lay shattered beside him. On the floor near his outstretched hand lay a heavy leather-bound volume, a compendium of exotic orchidaceae. Dr. Gable knelt. He's alive. A nasty blow to the head, but his pulse is steady. As the doctor tended to the wound, the rest of the household crowded into the doorway, their faces a gallery of shock and fear. This new development changed the texture of our predicament entirely. It transformed our passive, waiting game into something active and terrifyingly immediate. A killer was not just among us, they were still at work. Suspicion, which had been a diffuse fog, now began to coalesce. It must have been Croft, Elena cried, her voice sharp with hysteria. He was prowling the halls just a moment ago. I saw his shadow pass my door. He's gone mad. Julian Croft, who had been standing at the back of the group, pushed his way forward. I was securing the shutters on the landing window. He snarled, his eyes blazing. Unlike some, I attend to my duties. The accusation, however, had found fertile ground. The men looked at Croft, at his large, capable hands, and saw a weapon. Mr. Pym, a rival who could perhaps have seen something near the greenhouse, was now silenced. The narrative was simple, compelling, and utterly terrifying. Only the quick intervention of Dr. Gable prevented the confrontation from escalating into outright violence. But as I watched the scene unfold, A small, insistent voice in my mind whispered that it was all wrong. It was too neat, too theatrical. The attack on Mr. Pym served one primary purpose. It redirected the flow of suspicion entirely onto one man, Julian Croft. And more importantly, it appeared to absolve Mr. Pym himself. What better way to remove oneself from a list of suspects than to become the next victim? A classic maneuver. Ah, but my dear reader, when a crime is too obvious, one must always look for the artist who has painted the scene. I allowed the chaos to subside, letting the others exhaust themselves with accusations and fear. Then, when a fragile, nerve-shredded calm had been restored, I did something rather out of character. I stood before the fireplace, cleared my throat, and requested everyone's presence. "I believe," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly steady in the cavernous room, "that it is time we talked. Not with anger or fear, but with logic. We have a puzzle before us. A riddle, if you will, the riddle of the rose garden, and I believe we have all the pieces required for its solution." They gathered, a reluctant and suspicious congregation. Elena sank gracefully onto a chaise longue, a portrait of tragic beauty. Julian Croft stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask. Dr. Gable watched me with a cautious, clinical curiosity. Beatrice the girl hovered near the back, a pale shadow. Mr. Pym had been moved to a sofa where he lay moaning softly, a damp cloth on his head. "Let us begin with the central impossibility," I said, warming to my theme. Lord Alastair was found in a room locked and bolted from the inside. We have established that no one could have entered or left after the door was secured. We have also, I think, dismissed the notion of suicide. Therefore, we must conclude that Lord Alastair was not murdered in the greenhouse at all. This statement was met with blank incomprehension. "But that's impossible," Dr. Gable interjected. "He was seen walking to the greenhouse." "He was found there. He was indeed found there," I agreed. "But he was dying from the moment he touched the rose. The method of murder was not an act of violence, but an act of almost scientific precision. It was ingenious, patient, and diabolically poetic." I paused, letting my words settle. The little grey cells were firing now, arranging the facts into a coherent, unassailable line. The poison was not in a drink, it was not in the air. It was administered through the small puncture mark on his finger, a puncture made by a thorn on the crimson tear. "Dr. Gable, you are a medical man. What poison, introduced in a minuscule quantity, could induce symptoms that mimic a sudden, fatal cardiac event?" Dr. Gable's eyes widened slightly. "A powerful cardiotoxin, something from the digitalis family, perhaps." "Extracted from foxgloves." "Precisely," I said. "Foxgloves, which I have noted grow in abundance in the herbaceous border not 50 feet from the greenhouse." I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. The murderer knew 3 things. They knew of Lord Alastair's weak heart, a secret he guarded closely. They knew of his obsessive habit of stroking the petals and stem of his beloved rose. And they knew how to extract a deadly poison from a common garden flower. They prepared this poison, and, using a hypodermic needle of exceeding fineness, injected a fatal dose into one of the thorns of the crimson tear, turning his greatest love into the instrument of his death. Lord Alastair went to his sanctum, locked the door for privacy, touched his beloved flower as he always did, pricked his finger and succumbed within minutes. A perfect, self-administered murder. A collective gasp went through the room. The sheer cold-blooded brilliance of the scheme was dawning on them. "But who?" Elena whispered. "Who could know such things?" "The knowledge of the poison points to the gardener," I said, looking directly at Julian Croft. "The knowledge of the heart condition points to the doctor. The desire for the prize points to Mr. Pym. The need for an inheritance points to Lady Finch. But it is the confluence of all the necessary knowledge that reveals our killer." My gaze left the stunned faces of the primary suspects and settled on the pale, silent girl standing in the shadows. It was someone who moved unseen, someone who listened. Someone with a deep and precise knowledge of botany, who would know how to handle such toxins. Someone who found the small vial and pretended to be shocked by it, when in fact she was retrieving it from the place she had dropped it. Someone whose small footprint was left in the mud by the greenhouse door. Someone who struck Mr. Pym not to silence him, but to create a diversion, a red herring of the most dramatic sort, to cast suspicion firmly onto her uncle. I turned fully towards her. The room was utterly silent, save for the sputtering of the fire. "It was you, wasn't it, Beatrice?" Chapter 4. The silence that followed my accusation was profound, a vacuum into which all the room's air and warmth seemed to have been drawn. Beatrice Holloway did not flinch. She simply stood there, a slender silhouette against the dark wood of the library door, and the watchful stillness that I had mistaken for shyness was revealed for what it truly was. A core of absolute, icy resolve. Julian Croft took a half-step forward, his face a mask of anguish. "No," he rasped. "You're wrong, it was me. I hated him for what he did to my sister. I poisoned the thorn." "Ah, but my dear reader, a noble lie is often the most transparent of all," I said, my voice softer now. "Your confession is one of love, Mr. Croft, not of guilt. You are trying to protect her, but you are not the murderer. You may be an accomplice after the fact, through your silence, but you did not conceive of this. This crime required a subtlety of mind and a patience you do not possess. Your passion is of the soil, hot and quick to anger. This was cold, precise, and born of a much deeper wound." I turned back to the girl. The final piece of the puzzle was the burnt fragment of the letter I found. Lord Alastair wrote of a debt of the past that had to be paid for the sake of her memory. "I believe her was your mother, Beatrice, Julian Croft's sister." Beatrice's chin lifted, and for the first time her eyes met mine directly. They were not the eyes of a timid girl, but of a judge who had passed a sentence and seen it carried out. "He was my father," she said, her voice clear and devoid of emotion. "Lord Alastair Finch. He had an affair with my mother, a gardener's girl on this very estate, years before he married his precious Lillian. When she became pregnant, he cast her out, paid her off with a pittance. My uncle Julian found her, destitute and heartbroken. He took us in. She died when I was 5. He never acknowledged me. He never sent another penny. He let his own child grow up as a servant in his garden, watching him pour all the love and pride he should have given me into a flower. The confession, delivered so plainly, was more shocking than any hysterical outburst. We were not looking at a common criminal, but at an agent of a long-delayed, terrible justice. The crimson tear," she continued, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. "He called it his greatest creation, his legacy. I thought it only fitting that his legacy should be his executioner. I learned botany at my uncle's knee. I learned of poisons from his books. I learned of his heart condition from a careless conversation doctor. Gable had with him in the garden one afternoon. All the pieces were there, I just had to arrange them. The locked room, the perfect alibi, the poetic symbolism, it was all her design. The petal on his lips was her final, contemptuous kiss goodbye. The attack on Mr. Pym was a calculated act of misdirection, a quick, sharp blow with the heavy book when he had his back turned. She had gambled that in the ensuing panic no one would question her, the quiet, grieving niece. "The debt of the past," I murmured, understanding at last. Lord Alastair had finally developed a conscience. "The letter fragment suggests he was planning to acknowledge you, perhaps in his new will." "A little late for that," Beatrice said, her voice flat. "He wanted to pay his debt to cleanse his own soul, not to heal my life. He wanted to buy forgiveness, but some things are not for sale." There was nothing more to be said. The riddle was solved. The roots of the crime ran deep, back into a past of arrogance and cruelty, and had finally borne their poisonous fruit. Julian Croft moved to his niece's side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder, his face a ruin of love and regret. He had known. He had watched her plan her vengeance, his heart torn between the law and his loyalty to the child of the sister he had lost. As if summoned by the resolution of the drama, a pale, watery dawn began to break, filtering through the rain-streaked windows. With the light came a distant sound, the rumble of an engine. The storm had passed. The bridge was clear. The world was returning to Blackwood Manor. The authorities arrived to find a confession and a household of shattered nerves. Beatrice did not resist. She walked out of the house with a quiet dignity that was more chilling than any remorse. The great mystery was over, but the moral ambiguity of it all hung in the air. Justice had been done, but it was a wild, untamed justice, grown in a garden of secrets and watered with tears. As I departed later that day, I took one last look at the greenhouse. A ray of morning sun struck the glass, and through it I could see the crimson tear. It had bloomed fully in the night, a flower of impossible beauty and depth, its velvet petals the colour of freshly spilled blood. It was a monument to a man's obsession, a daughter's revenge, and the terrible, tangled nature of the human heart.